Oxford Professor Andrew Pettigrew is a leading expert in the academic world for his work on managing strategic change processes within organizations. His papers and books are distinctive because of his approach considering human and social aspects as complementary to theory. But what's the point in publishing if there is no link between the academic world and the public and private sectors? Clearly, none. That's why Xerfi Canal asked him about the impacts of management research on competitiveness. Andrew Pettigrew, thanks for joining us on Xerfi Canal. Your contribution this morning at la Journée de la FNEGE was about the impact of research on competitiveness. It can be for a firm, for a nation. So have the research already made impacts, clear impacts that we can measure on competitiveness?
I think so. I think this is one area where management research has made a contribution. I think, unfortunately, the research in this area didn't start until the 1980s and 90s. And before that, most of the important research in this area had been done by macroeconomics. And it was important research. I mean, it looked at the influence of exchange rates on competitiveness. It looked at the impact of financial institutions in different societies on competitiveness. And it looked, of course, at the nature and quality of industrial relations as it affected competitiveness. But the management research has brought a new dimension to this. And particularly, it's looked at the adaptation of firms, the capacity of firms to change under environmental pressure. And one of the big projects that was done in this area looked at the role of the assessment of the environment of firms. How good were firms at assessing the environment, the changing environment they were in? How good were firms at leading change once they had identified where the big changes where the environment were? The importance of linking strategic and operational change. In other words, the link between the very top of the firm and the middle and lower ranks of the firm, where often there's a big gap. The people at the top think they're in charge, but they're pulling levers which aren't connected to anything, so they're not in charge, you know. And we also looked at the role of investment in people as a factor in influencing competitiveness, i.e., of course, as the firm's competitive environments are changing, so they need new skills, new knowledge in the firm. And this means that you have to invest in people to do that. And finally, we found that the ability of firms to manage multiple change processes at the same time. So this was one particular study which was published by in a book called Managing Change for Competitive Success by Pettigrew and Whip, which introduced the role of management as a factor in explaining competitiveness. So we have made some important strides in it. And of course, there's been other work done as well, which of course there's not time for me to mention at the moment. So yes, we've made a contribution there.
And what about the contribution for the nation's competitiveness?
Well, I think that's a much more difficult area where I think macroeconomics has played a much more significant factor. I mean, I think management scholars tend not to look at the nation as the unit of analysis. They tend to look at the firm or the sector as the unit of analysis. So there have been interest in there. I mean, notably the work of Michael Porter at Harvard Business School. But I gave these examples to make the point, the more general, the bigger point, that unfortunately too much management research today is theory-driven and method-driven and not issue-driven. And competitiveness is an example of issue-driven research. And my assumption this morning was that if all other things being equal, if you choose issues of importance to society and study those, the probabilities of research having an impact are naturally increased, you know. So, but if work is just theory-driven or method-driven, although theory and method are both important, it distorts the kind of the domain of research, and therefore it reduces the potential for the research to have an impact. So that was one of my main messages this morning.
This morning you also talked about academic research, how it works today, pointing out that there was a gap that was getting wider and wider between research and teaching, leading to schools spending amounts of money to hire the best researchers that were not necessary teaching to students directly. How do we get out of this system that led to the huge amount of debt in the US for the students?
Well, I think this is a much bigger issue. I think the narrower, perhaps, but equally important issue I was trying to get across this morning was that publishing itself is just an intermediate good. The final good in publishing is when you have some sort of impact with your research. And that impact can be both scholarly impact and policy and practice impact. So that was the major point I was trying to make. And I was also trying to suggest that this requires scholars to be faced with a double hurdle, a double challenge. Somehow or other to do work of the highest possible scholarly quality and at the same time to have policy and practice impact. So, my suggestion was that scholars who are able to meet this double challenge will by necessity be more engaged with society. And I think in a sense the key to the future impact of business schools I was suggesting was to do with business school professors being more engaged. And that just doesn't mean engaged in research, it means engaged in the classroom, it means engaged with governments, it means engaged with policymakers, it means engaged with business, large and small business. And I was suggesting that one of the key requirements for the future success both of business school professors and the business schools they're part, which will also influence their financial viability, has to do with this creating a greater proportion of what I call engaged professors. And engaged professors means professors who are not just engaged with the academy, but are engaged beyond the academy and influencing people in government, in business, in the third sector, in the voluntary sector, in the public services as well. And that's the key I'm suggesting in the long term to a successful professor in a business school and ultimately to a successful business school. How engaged are the professors and is the business school itself?
Do you think the emergence of digital tools like MOOCs or things like this, or open access, can help the whole academic world to have more influence?
Without a doubt. I think MOOCs are going to, in fact, disturb the competitive environment, the easy competitive environment that most business schools have become accustomed to. They're a real threat. But at the same time, I think the history of the development of new technologies over the last 40 or 50 years is that people always over-exaggerate the effect of new technologies. They always think, this is the end of the world when a new technology is invented, or it's going to bring about some traumatic change. And if you look at the history of development of technologies, whether they're the original mainframe computers or digital technologies more recently, they've never had the impact at the speed that people often profess. In fact, people make careers and money out of proclaiming, there's going to be a disaster, or there's going to be a disaster, listen to me because I'm the latest expert on whatever new technology is emerging. So I think people always overstate technological impacts. But nevertheless, I don't think there's any doubt that the development of MOOCs and in business education will have a big impact. And it's just a question of how long it lasts. And it will mean that business schools who operate in more conventional modes will have to find other ways of operating in order to challenge the competition that's going to happen from these new players in the competitive game.
You said a very important sentence this morning. We forgot the signification of what we were publishing because focusing too much on the fact of publishing. That's a convention business schools need to get rid of?
Yes, I think so. And I said a number of things about that. One was that we are becoming fixated by where we publish and how we publish and not enough with what we publish. Hence my interest in big issues, studying big issues. That's the route to being concerned with what we publish. Basically, people are beyond academia are less interested in where and how, and they're more interested in what business schools publish. Is it useful? Is it impact? That's what they're interested in, and so we need to reinvigorate the importance of the what we publish and focus less on the where and the how.
Andrew Pettigrew, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you.